Thank you. So today I will talk about the blockchain, but I'm not going to talk about Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, tokens, or ICO. And instead, I will focus on what I consider to be one of the most fascinating aspects of these new technologies, which is the ability to operate autonomously and to interact with its own environment like an independent entity. And so, before we begin, let's start with a short introduction. What is the blockchain and how does it work? So, the easiest way to explain the functionalities of the blockchain is by analogy with the internet. The internet has enabled us to communicate on a peer-to-peer basis. And it also has led to the emergence of those peer-to-peer file-sharing networks, which makes it possible for people to exchange information directly with one another. And because everything is digital, anyone can take a digital file, reproduce it, and distribute it to others without losing the access to their own copy of that digital file. And this is great when it comes to exchanging information and knowledge. But of course, it can be quite problematic when it comes to exchanging money or any other kind of resources which is inherently scarce. And this is why when we want to exchange or transfer money over the internet, we generally rely on those financial intermediaries, like banks or PayPals, which are responsible for verifying the transactions in order to make sure that no one can spend more money than what they actually have. Now, the problem with this model is that these operators are actually introducing a new layer of centralization over the internet, and the system only works so long as we can trust those operators. And so, what if, instead of delegating those tasks to a centralized operator, we could create instead a decentralized payment system? And this system already exists, and it is Bitcoin, a virtual currency that can be traded on a peer-to-peer network without the need for any bank or other financial intermediary. So Bitcoin was created in 2008 by a pseudonymous entity called Satoshi Nakamoto. And as opposed to traditional fiat currencies like euros or dollars, which are issued by a central bank and controlled by a state, the issuance of Bitcoin is defined by a computer protocol which precisely stipulates the total amount of Bitcoins that will ever be created, 21 million, and the speed at which those Bitcoins will be generated. Today, it is 12.5 Bitcoins every 10 minutes, more or less. And so Bitcoins, to some extent, replicates or simulates the characteristic of gold. Gold cannot be created out of nothing. It must be extracted from the ground, and as time passes and the reserve of gold gets depleted, then the harder it becomes to find new gold. And in the same way, Bitcoins cannot be created out of nothing. New Bitcoins are generated every time a computer identifies the solution to a mathematical problem whose difficulty increases with the network size. And this means that the more people are actually contributing resources to the network, then the harder it becomes to generate new Bitcoins. And this mathematical problem is actually quite similar to the problem of finding the solution to a padlock. So one needs to try every single possibility in order to find the right combination, but once the combination has been found, it's very easy for others to verify that it is indeed the correct solution. Now, you might wonder, of course, because it is a virtual currency, then how can we trust the system? How can we be sure that people will not reproduce and multiply their Bitcoins in the same way as they can reproduce digital content? And so the Bitcoin networks actually operate on top of another technology, the blockchain. And this technology makes it possible to exchange value in a secure and decentralized manner without the need for any trusted authority or financial operator. And so how does it work exactly? Well, instead of assigning to a third party the task of verifying all the transactions, with Bitcoin, the history of all transactions is stored on a common database, the blockchain. And this database is shared among all network participants who contribute to the verification and to the validation of those transactions. And because every single node holds a copy of the blockchain, it is virtually impossible to cheat, because if one person tries to modify even a single one of those transactions, the fraud will be immediately detected by all the network participants. And then, once those transactions have been validated, they are stored in a chronological order inside a block of transactions which incorporate a reference to the previous blocks. And this reference is part of the same mathematical problem which I have mentioned before. This means that the only way to validate transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain is to find the right combination that will enable the system to attach a new block of transactions to the previous chain of blocks. And so the blockchain is, after all, just this long chain of transactions which reference each other. And the longer is the chain, the higher will be the security of the network, because the modification of a single one of those transactions will invalidate the reference to the previous blocks, which will inevitably break the chain. Now, you might ask, of course, what is it that makes the blockchain so special? Is it really something entirely new that did not exist before? Or is it just some kind of incremental innovation that is building on top of an existing set of technologies? And so, in order to answer this question, let's focus for a moment on what are those unique characteristics of a blockchain. So, first of all, a blockchain is a decentralized database that operates on top of a peer-to-peer network. And so, just like the internet, it is global and transnational in the sense that it simply does not account for national boundaries. And then, secondly, a blockchain is also replicated on the computer of every single node on the network. And this, of course, makes the network extremely resilient. And because every single one of those nodes is actually following the exact same protocol, then it is extremely difficult to modify, to change, or to tamper with the data stored on the blockchain without the consensus of all other participants. And then a blockchain is also inherently transparent, in the sense that everyone can see what everyone else is doing. And because every single transaction is cryptographically signed with the key of the party recording it, then it is impossible later on to deny or to pretend not to have engaged into such a transaction. And then a blockchain is also pseudonymous, at least in the case of public blockchain. And this means that people do not actually need to identify themselves as individuals in order to actually participate. They only need to register an account on the network in order to obtain an address that will then uniquely identify them in a pseudonymous manner. And then finally, the most advanced blockchains enable us not only to store data, but also to store and execute software code that will run with a guarantee of execution, in the sense that no one can unilaterally change, influence, or even stop the execution of that code. And so, how does that actually differ from traditional software code? Well, on the internet, we have this notion of lex informatica, which essentially just means that code is increasingly being used as a means to regulate behaviors. And so code is law because code is actually assuming the same functionalities as the law, even though, of course, this code is still under the control of centralized operators, which remains under the traditional rule of the law. Now, when we move into a blockchain-based system, code is also used as a means to regulate behaviors. The difference this time is that because of the specific and distinctive characteristic of a blockchain, then blockchain-based code can actually be designed to largely ignore the traditional rule of law. And so the only law that actually matters in the system is the code. And so what are the implications of that? So first of all, blockchain technologies actually reduce the needs for traditional intermediaries or trusted authority because they are actually delegating the trust away from those centralized operators and towards the underlying technology. And so as long as people can trust the technology, then they don't need to actually trust any other party. And then blockchain technologies also create new opportunities for increasing the automation and the autonomy of those systems. Because once they have been deployed on a blockchain, a particular software no longer need nor hit their creators, because they can be designed to operate autonomously and independently of the original will of the parties deploying them. And so this, of course, can create some potential conflict between the rule of law and the rule of code. And so what we will explore next is what is the interplay between those two types of regulation, regulation by code and regulation by law, and whether one could potentially overtake the other. Can blockchain-based systems be forced to comply with the law? Or can they be used instead to bypass existing rules and regulations to the extent that they operate within their own and separate technical framework? And so if we back up a little and we look at the early narratives of the internet, then we can remember the claims from some of the internet pioneers like John Perry Barlow or Timothy May, who saw the cyberspace as an independent space that simply could not be regulated because governments simply did not have the right or the capacity to exert their sovereignty over it. And then, of course, as we all know by now, many of these promises did not actually materialize in the same way as many of us would have hoped for. And the internet, which was initially seen as this tool to promote individual freedom and autonomy, has eventually become a powerful tool of surveillance and control. And in fact, as soon as the initial fear of crypto-anarchy actually faded away, then it became clear that it's actually not too difficult to regulate the internet. Because even though direct regulation by law is difficult, because code is increasingly being used in order to regulate behavior, then governments can actually use the law in order to regulate the code by exerting pressure on those online intermediaries which are actually operating and deploying that code. And so the question is, can the same model be actually applied in the context of a blockchain-based system? And the difference with the blockchain is that we're actually losing one of the most powerful means of regulation, which is the intermediary operator. And if there are no intermediaries, then it becomes much harder to leverage the traditional means of regulation that were available on the internet, because it actually becomes very difficult to even identify what is the object of regulation. And so if we look at the narratives and the promises of early blockchain advocates, then we might notice that those are actually quite similar to those promoted by the early internet pioneers. And so the question that we ask ourselves is, can blockchain technology actually succeed where the internet has failed? Can this technology become this tool for disintermediation and individual emancipation that the early internet pioneers were advocating for? And can it help materialize those visions of the early cypherpunk and actually lead to a new wave of crypto-anarchy? Well, when talking about the regulation of the cyberspace, people introduce the notion of unregulability in order to highlight the difficulties inherent into the regulation of such a decentralized and transnational network like the internet. And in the blockchain space, people actually prefer to describe those platforms as being illegal, in the sense that they operate entirely outside of the purview of the law. And so the idea is that the blockchain implements its own technical framework that operates according to its own rules and that cannot be touched or affected by the law. And we are already seeing quite a few blockchain-based applications which are actually in conflict with existing laws and regulations. And most of those applications are actually leveraging the pseudonymity of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies in order to facilitate money laundering or in order to set up those decentralized marketplaces for the trading of illicit goods or services. And then more recently, we have seen that the tamper-resistant features of a blockchain actually can be abused in order to store illegitimate content, copyright infringement, hate speech, or even linked to illegal pornography, but also that makes it difficult to enforce specific rights that actually require the deletion of content, such as, for instance, the right to be forgotten. But the distinction between the rule of code and the rule of law is actually the most obvious in the context of property. So traditional property rights are defined by the law and can therefore also be taken away by the law. So if I acquire a particular piece of property in a way that turns out to be illegitimate, then a court order or a judge could actually declare that I am not the legitimate owner of that property and potentially take it away from me. When we move into a blockchain-based system, then we encounter those new types of cryptographic assets or blockchain-based property, which actually do not follow the same rules. And so if I illegitimately acquire a Bitcoin, then regardless of what the law says, no one actually has the ability to seize it from me unless the code specifically provides for that. And then the same applies in the context of contracts. Traditional legal contracts are created according to specific rules which have been defined by contract law and which are meant to create a binding agreement between two parties. But those agreements can only be enforced by a third-party authority which needs to read and understand the meaning of the words of the contract in order to actually understand what the real intentions of the parties were. And then again, when we move into a blockchain-based systems, then we encounter those new types of contractual relationship, the so-called smart contracts, which are actually operating according to the rules of the code deployed on the blockchain. And so those agreements no longer require third-party enforcement because the contractual provisions will be automatically enforced by the underlying technology, which of course is incapable of understanding what the real intentions of the parties are and will just apply the wording of the code. And perhaps the best example that illustrates this conflict between the rule of law and the rule of code has been provided by the DAO, which was a decentralized investment fund deployed as a smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain, which managed to raise over $150 million in less than 1 month. And this decentralized investment fund did not actually have any CEO or any board of directors. Instead, it was collectively managed by all the investors, which actually could participate in the decision-making in proportion with the amount of money that they had put into the fund. And because there was no management structure, then the rule of governance for these funds were actually defined only and exclusively by the code of the smart contract on the blockchain. And so the problem is that one day, someone identified a vulnerability in the code of the smart contract governing this fund and exploited that vulnerability in order to extract over $60 million from the fund. And this raised very interesting and very heated discussions about whether this action actually qualified as a theft to the extent that it actually went counter to the original intentions of the contracting parties, or whether it could instead be regarded as a legitimate action to the extent that it actually did not violate the wording of the code. And even though most people will actually agree that it was a theft, the interesting aspect was that it was not possible to rely on the traditional means of the law in order to actually enforce those rules. On the one hand, because it was not possible to revert the transaction because of the immutability of the Ethereum blockchain. And secondly, because there was no centralized authority, it was not possible to seize those stolen funds in order to return them to the original investor. And so the only way to remediate this tort was for the whole Ethereum community as a whole to actually take a coordinated action and to actually go and change the rule of the underlying blockchain protocol in order to potentially and eventually give the money back to the investor. And so, in spite of the failure of this decentralized investment fund, this has shown us that it is now possible to interact with those blockchain-based systems in the same way as we interact today with a traditional company or organization. And in fact, in some cases, people have been trying to even replace those traditional organizations with those new kind of decentralized blockchain-based organizations using economic incentives and code-based protocols in order to coordinate hundreds and thousands of individuals around a common goal. And of course, there is nothing special about that, you might say. People have been doing that for many years already. And the internet has shown us, in fact, that open and decentralized collaboration makes it possible to achieve things that will be extremely difficult to achieve internally within a single company or organization. And the success of this model has inspired a few economic actors to experiment with new business models that rely on the power of the crowd in order to produce value. And this is the model adopted most notably by the big internet giants like Google, Facebook, or Twitter, as well as by those new crowdsourcing organizations like Uber or Airbnb. Now, the problem with this model is that, in most cases, the value produced by the crowd is not equally redistributed between the platform operators and the contributors. And it is instead concentrated into the hands of those large centralized operators, which ultimately dictate the rule of the platform. And so the question then is whether blockchain technologies could indeed disrupt the disruptors and potentially make those centralized entities obsolete. And we are already seeing the first glimmers of this new world. Over the past few years, we have seen a variety of new blockchain-based applications, such as, for instance, decentralized marketplaces like eBay, but without eBay, or decentralized social networks like Facebook, but without Facebook, and even decentralized ride-sharing applications, just like Uber, but without Uber. And even though none of those applications actually managed to reach mainstream adoption, they have nonetheless shown that there are new avenues and new opportunities for change. And in fact, if we look at the ways in which organizational structures have evolved over the past 20 years, we can see that there is a general trend from centralized operators, which are providing a service to a passive set of consumers, to centralized intermediaries, which are aggregating the contribution of multiple people in order to provide a service to a much more active set of consumers. And then finally, to those fully decentralized networks, which also aggregate the contribution of multiple people, but that do not require a centralized operator in order to manage the flow of contributions. And so how do those decentralized networks operate and coordinate themselves? So in the case of most blockchain-based applications, they operate according to the principle of tokenization, which essentially means that whoever is contributing resources to that network will be compensated with a particular amount of tokens as a reward. And those tokens have both an intrinsic value, in the sense that they can be used and spent on the network in order to benefit from the service provided by this application, as well as an extrinsic value, to the extent that they can be sold on the market to whoever did not contribute to the application, but nonetheless would like to benefit from the service that it provides. And so from an historical perspective, we can see how Bitcoin can actually be regarded as the first kind of a decentralized blockchain-based organization, to the extent that it is a decentralized payment system that is operated thanks to the contribution of thousands of miners who all are providing their own computing power to the network and are compensated with a particular amount of Bitcoins as a reward. And those Bitcoins can either be spent directly on the network in the form of transaction fees in order to actually be able to use this decentralized payment system, or they can be sold on the market in order to be converted into a monetary reward. And then in the same way, Ethereum is actually adopting the exact same model as Bitcoin in order to create this kind of decentralized world computer or decentralized operating system, which is itself also operated thanks to the contribution of miners. And the interesting aspect of this is that instead of deploying a software on a centralized server, it is now possible to deploy software code directly on the blockchain, where it will be executed in a decentralized manner by all the network participants. And so this means that we can now deploy software entities on a blockchain in such a way that they can de facto act as an autonomous agent. And those agents can, in fact, own property to the extent that this property can be digitally represented into the blockchain, but they can also engage into a series of contractual relationships through those blockchain-based smart contracts. And most importantly, even though the majority of those agents are actually quite simple or stupid to the extent that they do not actually benefit from decisional autonomy, they do enjoy a different kind of autonomy, which is mostly operational, in that they can be designed to operate autonomously and independently of any third party. And so this leads us to what I consider to be one of the most exciting aspects of the blockchain, which is the ability to create those new kind of algorithmical entities that can be regarded to some extent as a blockchain-based life form, because they are autonomous, self-sufficient, in that they can collect the resources necessary for their own survival, and of course, like any other kind of life form, they are potentially capable of reproducing themselves. And of course, this might be quite confusing at first, but in order to illustrate this concept, I have brought here a small prototype of a blockchain-based life form, which is a plantoid. So a plantoid is the Android version of a plant, and it is my own personal attempt at illustrating in the physical world what are the core functionalities of a decentralized blockchain-based organization. And so, what is a plantoid and how does it work? So, traditional plants, most of them at least, are incapable of reproducing themselves on their own. And they need the help of third parties like bees or butterflies in order to help them reproduce through the pollination process. In the same way, plantoids are incapable to reproduce themselves on their own. And they require the help of third parties to help them reproduce by donating capital to them in the form of cryptocurrencies. And so one important thing to understand about a plantoid is that it is made of two separate components. One is the body of the plantoid, which is a mechanical sculpture that exists in the physical world. And the other one is the spirit or the soul of the plantoid, which subsists as a smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain. And those two components interact with each other in order to actually bring the plantoid to life, and of course, in order to ensure its reproduction. So let's go through the various phases of reproduction of a plantoid. The first one is the capitalization phase. And this is when the plantoid will make itself beautiful in order to lure people into donating some cryptocurrencies to it. And so every plantoid has its own Bitcoin and Ethereum wallet that people can send funds to. And whenever they receive some funds, they will show some form of appreciation by doing some dance or music or some light show. So let me do a small demonstration here. I'm going to feed this plantoid with some bitcoins, and hopefully it will be thankful for that. There we go. So every plantoid is constantly monitoring its own balance. And whenever it's realizing that it has accumulated a sufficient amount of funds in order to reproduce itself, then it will trigger the smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain, which will activate the second phase of reproduction, which is the mating phase. And this is when the plantoid will start looking for an actual mate to help it reproduce. And this is done via the smart contract on Ethereum, which will essentially open a call inviting people, artists, designers, or anyone to submit propositions as to how they envision to produce the next plantoid. And then all those who have funded the plantoid can then vote on the propositions that they like the most, and the smart contract will then weight every single one of those votes by the amount of funds that they have sent in the first place. And then eventually, the smart contract will identify a winner, and this will trigger the third phase of reproduction, which is the hiring phase. And this is when the plantoid will then execute a smart contract transaction in order to transfer the funds that it has collected so far to the selected winner, who will then be hired by the plantoid in order to create a new copy of itself. And so here you can see the genealogical tree of the plantoid species. And so as you can see, this is plantoid number 4, which is the result of the reproduction of plantoid number 2, which is itself a descendant of the genesis plantoid number 1. And every plantoid needs to abide by the constraints which have been encoded into the DNA of its parents. And so in the case of this plantoid, it has to be made of chain, as required by the genesis plantoid 1, and it has to show this kind of rainbowish light show, as required by its parent, plantoid number 2. And then every artist can then introduce additional constraints into the genetic code of the plantoid that they are producing. And so here I have added the additional obligation that the plantoid needs to vibrate while it is being fed. So all the descendants of this plantoid will also have to encode this condition. And so we can see how this creates some kind of evolutionary algorithm where different plantoids will evolve into multiple species, each one with its own distinctive characteristic. And so the plantoids that are the most popular will be able to collect more cryptocurrencies and therefore will be able to reproduce more, whereas the ones that are the least appreciated will eventually just fade out into extinction. And so eventually, we will be able to find out which one of those plantoids are the most fit for their own environment, and those are the ones that will be able to reproduce more and potentially start colonizing our planet. And then, of course, plantoids are not inherently selfish, but they also care about their own creators. And so every time a plantoid accumulates enough funds to reproduce itself, it is sending a small portion of those funds back to its parent, the plantoid that generated it, and another small portion of those funds is actually sent to its creator, to the artist that actually produced it. And so this kind of pyramid scheme actually comes with two important benefits. The first one is that I created the genesis plantoid, and so I currently stand at the top of this pyramid, which is great. But the second one, most importantly, is that this actually creates a positive incentive for every artist to actually produce the most beautiful plantoid, because the more popular the plantoid will be, then the more will be the amount of royalties that they will be able to collect over time. And so the most interesting aspect of this model is that this actually disrupts the traditional conception of copyright law, which is based on the notion of scarcity and exclusivity. Whereas here, every artist actually has an incentive to maximize the dissemination of its work, because that will give more visibility to the plantoid so that he can collect more funds, but also to encourage the remix and the creation of derivative works, because that will actually maximize a potential return on investment. But most importantly, this system is actually shifting the focus away from the artist and toward the art piece. And so instead of funding an artist in the hopes that the artist will continue to create works that we like, we now have the possibility of funding the art piece itself, and it is then up to the art piece to decide who is the artist that will be entitled to reproduce it. Now, of course, the plantoid is just one particular example of a specific type of blockchain-based life form. But there are actually many other blockchain-based life forms out there. And in fact, many of the existing blockchain-based networks can be regarded as a very precarious type of blockchain-based life form, because they are autonomous to the extent that they operate independently of any third party. They are self-sufficient because they can actually sustain themselves over time through the issuance of their own tokens to the miners. And of course, like any other life form, they are also capable of reproducing themselves into multiple species or breeds. And then there are also a whole new variety of blockchain-based applications, which can also be regarded as a blockchain-based life form. And those are the so-called decentralized applications or decentralized autonomous organizations, which are also autonomous, which are also self-sufficient because they are also creating their own token-based system in order to fund and sustain their operation, and of course, which are also potentially capable of expanding, growing, and reproducing themselves. And then we have the more advanced versions of a blockchain-based life form, which actually instantiate themselves into the physical world. And this is the case, of course, of the plantoid, but also of a variety of other artistic projects, at least, such as, for instance, TerraZero, which is using a blockchain in order to help forests sell their own trees and then use the money that they have collected in order to purchase their own land and potentially emancipate themselves from their owners. And then we also have the more futuristic ideas of a self-driving car that actually owns itself. And so the car can collect money when it's traveling and providing rides to people in the street, and then use this money in order to purchase some gas or electricity, or perhaps to pay people in order to repair or upgrade itself if it has accumulated sufficient funds to do so. Now, of course, you might wonder, why limit ourselves to an autonomous car when we could actually create autonomous agents which are actually collecting money for the services that they are providing to society, and then use that money in order to feed themselves with electricity, but perhaps also in order to hire people to work for them, and eventually, one day, perhaps even use this money in order to reproduce themselves, just like the plantoid does. And of course, we are still in the realm of science fiction here, but those opportunities are actually quite real, as demonstrated by this plantoid out there. And it is probably just a matter of time before we see those new blockchain-based life forms actually come to life. Thank you.